We invited Marjorie to keynote this forum because we believe that she can give us some new ideas about what a resilient and creative local economy can look like. And she's going to challenge some of your assumptions, and she's going to put forth some new ideas. And because you all came here open to new concepts, we know that you will consider them carefully and look at how they might be applied to your understanding of Franklin County. And now it's time to begin our process of investigating new thoughts for a new time. Marjorie, Kelly, I'd like you to come.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Mayor Martin. I want to say, would you come work in my town? Some great things happening here. And thank to all of you for coming out on a Saturday morning, 9 a.m., although there's good pastries, so that makes it worthwhile. I think as Susan mentioned, I'm an author. I have a new book out called Owning Our Future, looking at locally based, locally owned economies. And I'm also a senior fellow at the Democracy Collaborative, and we're based in both Washington, D.C. and Cleveland, although I live in Boston area. So I want to talk today about how do we begin to put some principles and some frames around the great work that is happening here? And we see cities all over the country doing the kind of exciting things that Greenfield is doing. But I want to start with a story. And it's a story about a company called Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. And this is a company, it was at one time owned by Ruth. It's headquartered in New Orleans, or it was at one point. And this was a company that was a family-owned company. It was very rooted in its place. It had become quite large. There's steakhouses all over the country. Well, there was a time that a hurricane hit in New Orleans, and Ruth found herself with a freezer full of steaks rapidly thawing. And the power was out. She said, what shall I do? So she said, what the heck? She set up grills out in the streets. She started grilling those steaks and giving them away free to the rescue workers. So that was how Ruth was part of her community. Early 2005, Ruth's Chris Steakhouse went public. And for those of you who don't know these arcane terms, it means your shares are now trading on the stock market. So your ownership has become dispersed and can trade in nanoseconds. And lo and behold, later that year, another hurricane hit New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina. Now, what did the new CEO of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse do this time? He closed up shop and he moved out of town. Because he now had a duty not to his community. He didn't have the ability, really, he didn't feel that he had the ability to act from his heart, out of caring. He had a single obligation, which was to his stockholders, and he had to get his share price up quarter after quarter. So he left town. Ruth's family was furious. The community was furious. It created a huge scandal. Now, I tell this story because I think it's a very vivid example of the power of ownership, and how ownership is really a frame that contains a particular mission. It can either enable a mission, or it can disable it. In this case, when you have family ownership, you have local ownership, you can care about the community. When you have stock market ownership, it becomes more difficult. We often think about CEOs as the problem, and I like to point to the issue of ownership, which really greatly constrains CEOs. So here's another story about a company that took a different route, and it's right here in Pioneer Valley, and it's Real Pickles, and we have Real Pickles with us here today, right? So, nobody can run a company forever. There comes a time you usually need to sell, you need to transition ownership. So how did Real Pickles do it? Well, they decided to sell to employees. So this is a company where the founders sold to employees. They used a very innovative financing mechanism because, the challenge is always how do you get capital into these companies to make this transition. They did something called a direct public offering, and they raised $500,000 in just 2 months from 77 local investors. So it's a great example of how we can come together, keep our companies local, participate as investors, and transition ownership to employees. Now, this is likely to be a very different kind of company than Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. So what I would say is that ownership, it creates the frame. The ownership and financing creates the frame that can hold a mission in place. And Real Pickles has a very strong social mission. It's ecological, it wants to provide nourishing food, it's working for a regional organic food system. All of this, while it comes out of the heart of the founders, then we begin to design for it. And this is a key difference, that we design for social and ecological outcomes in the same way that right now we have an economy designed for financial outcomes. So why does local ownership matter? Well, local companies are less likely to get up and leave. You can preserve local jobs. Wealth can be spread more broadly. And it creates a kind of enduring, stable community that the mayor talked about. A lot of communities see companies leave town. This happened in Cleveland, where the Democracy Collaborative has offices. Cleveland at one time was a thriving community. It had an enormous number of publicly traded companies, Fortune 500 companies. Most of them left. The economy, the city lost more than half its population. And so now there's an effort to rebuild. And the Democracy Collaborative has been part of this rebuilding. And, just like Real Pickles, we opted for employee ownership. One of the examples is Evergreen Energy Solutions. Now, this is an employee-owned company. It installs solar panels. There's a couple of additional elements, though. This is a company that relies on what we call anchor procurement. We were working with the Cleveland Foundation, and you look around and you say, okay, if all these big companies left town, who didn't leave? Who's left? Well, a lot who was left were large nonprofit hospitals and universities. They were in a place called University Circle. And it turned out they were buying $3 billion worth of stuff. But they weren't buying any of it locally. And the University Circle was completely surrounded by disenfranchised communities. They had a low income, there was high unemployment, and none of them were working for these institutions. So we worked with a whole collaborative of people to help start some employee-owned companies. We went and did anchor interviews and said, okay, you big hospitals and universities, what are you buying? Where are you buying it? Is there any of it you could buy locally? And identified, I say we, I'll take credit for it, though my colleagues did it, I came after this, but identified 3 opportunities. And one was solar. And the solar company in particular, it started out by installing large solar arrays on the top of like a hospital or parking garages and things like that. So huge contracts that really helped this company get started. And there were others too. There's a large industrial laundry. It's doing green laundry, doing for large anchor buyers. And then a third company, which is Green City Growers. It's a big greenhouse. Like 3 football fields under glass, growing lettuce and herbs for the institutional market. Now, so we've started out talking about local ownership, employee ownership. But let's take that a little bit more broadly. So here we see, so not only are these locally owned companies, there's a network of them. There's 3. So they're connected together, and the idea is that we're stronger together than we are when we're isolated. There's a common holding company. It's called Evergreen Business Services, and it provides services to these employee-owned companies. Also, these employee-owned companies, they can't just get up and sell. I mean, they have their ownership shares, but there is a framework in place so they can't just sell the company and leave town. There's also a fund, so percentage of profits goes into this fund. It's being called the Cleveland model. So there's something about this model. There's maybe 100 jobs, okay? Let's be honest here. Cleveland Foundation spent a lot of money. It's only 100 jobs. There's a lot of things that are not perfect about this model. But there's also something about it that is galvanizing people. What we're trying to show, okay, so in the middle you have 3 worker cooperatives. There's a community foundation that helped launch these. There's a nonprofit corporation at the center of them providing services. There's anchor institutions that are buying from them, and they're hiring from the local community. So there's a whole design here. It's not isolated companies, it's a whole ecosystem of support. And I think that that's an important principle. I mean, you have a foundation, you have a community development financial institution, some technical assistance providers, helped get these started. You have the network of the 3, and then you have the anchor buyers, and the local community is the benefit. What's at work here, it's not just locally owned enterprise, and I think we all are in favor of locally owned enterprise, but something, a step up from that, and we call it community wealth building. And it's a name for an emerging approach to economic development. The old style of economic development we know well, and it's still there, and there's a lot of pressure to do this. You give tax breaks, you try to attract the big companies into your community. There are tens of billions of dollars spent on this every year. So communities basically kind of steal from each other. I was born and raised in Missouri, and there's a very famous border war between Kansas and Missouri. Kansas City straddles the river. One Kansas City is in Missouri, one Kansas City is in Kansas. And they steal companies back and forth from each other. They'll give tax breaks and say, no, you come over here. And the employees then will just drive across the bridge and, and go to the other company. But the taxpayers lose out because they're giving incentives for this. So it's insane. And people know that it's insane, and yet everyone feels trapped in it because communities need to show that they're growing jobs, or, quote, growing jobs. And so what's the alternative? And what I see happening here in Greenfield, and we see it, it's happening in Cleveland, it's really happening in many, many communities. We're doing work in New Orleans and Baltimore and Jacksonville, Mississippi, lots of places. People are grappling with, well, what else is there? How do you do it? If the idea is not to hit a home run and go public, which is sort of what a lot of the guys at MIT still think is the goal, and the goal is not to give tax breaks and attract the big companies. What is the goal? Well, the goal is what Susan talked about. We want to create sustainable local economies. We want to rebuild our communities. We want to keep wealth local. We want to create good living wage jobs. That's the goal. We want to create community wealth. And so what we do with Democracy Collaborative is we try to say, well, okay, what's the system for that? The first project I was brought on to lead is we're doing a learning action lab to work with a half-dozen Native American nonprofits in the Northwest area. And they want to start social enterprises and employee-owned companies. And so we're trying to teach this method. I mean, this method sort of arose in Cleveland and other places, and we're saying, okay, what are the principles? How do you begin to put some frames around this? So we sat down one day and came up with these, and for now, this is what we think it is. And I'm gonna walk through these. I mean, you start with, what do you value? Right now, we live with an economy that values financial wealth over everything else. You want to have as much wealth as possible. You want to take care of your family and sort of ignore everything else. That's what we value as a culture, and it's what is embedded in the ownership design of the publicly traded company. How can it, and no accident, it was the robber barons who gave us this design. So their aim was to create as much financial wealth as they could. They did a lot of good along the way, but it's gotten a little out of control. So we start with a different set of values, respect for place. Respect for place is, I believe, critical. That economies have to live somewhere. You know, we shouldn't be like getting stuff from, you know, sending, as they say, you know, sending the wood to China, they make it into toothpicks, and then they send it back, and we sell the toothpicks here. You know, there's something kind of silly about that. So economies have to live someplace. And we all live there, so it needs to be inclusive. I mean, we're rapidly moving to a minority majority in this country. So if we have an economy that leaves out people of color and women and low-income people, we're leaving out most of everybody. It's an asset-based approach. I mean, we recently were talking to some community foundations that are working on this, that are trying to emulate what Cleveland Foundation did. And one of them said to me, she said, well, you know, you're not focusing so much anymore on ending poverty, you're talking about building wealth. I mean, you still want to end poverty, but what are you focusing on? I mean, you need to focus on the positive. If you want to end poverty, then you might just put safety nets underneath people, you know, so that they have food and shelter, and we need to do that. And she was saying, but to help people change their frame of mind to think, no, I can actually create wealth. I can be an owner of this company. I mean, the people who are working at the Evergreen Cooperatives, they're able to buy homes. And people look at them, their neighbors, their children look at them, and you begin to get a sense of something very different is possible. So growing enterprises, linking to high demand, anchor institutions that I talked about, strengthening support networks. So instead of being isolated individuals or having isolated companies, we need support networks, and there's a lot of those here in this community. And anchoring ownership in community and keeping the wealth local. So let's look through some of these. The overlying idea to keep in mind is if we want an economy to have different outcomes, we can design for that. That system structure is the source of system behavior. The system is going to behave the way we set it up. If all the ownership is held in Wall Street and the definition of success is maximum price, maximum stock price, well, we're getting the results that we have designed for. You know, the 0.01% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. We're getting the results that we designed for, so we need to design for something else. And Ervin Laszlo, systems thinker, he says that cultures are, in the final analysis, value-guided systems. If you look at anything, a company, a town, a court system, these are all social architectures, and at their heart they have values. That's what they're built around. And so it's because values would tell us, well, what's the goal? What are we trying to do here? It's what we value. It's not somebody telling us to do it. It's what we really care about. So we start with values. And then we begin to develop community assets. I mean, this is certainly what business has done all along. It's an asset-based approach. But with community wealth building, there's more than one kind of asset. I mean, here at Greenfield, you're at the crossroads of broadband and rivers and roads. That's an asset. You know, location, that's an asset. The culture of this place, that's an asset. And, you know, there's a beautiful downtown. There's social networks. There's ideas. You know, there's models from around the country that we can begin to replicate. So all of these things are assets, and we can use these to begin to develop some local wealth. Now, I'll tell you a story about a group that I worked with in rural Arkansas. And this was there's a little CDC, Community Development Corporation, that was called Alt Consulting. And they were trying to get some work, get some development going in their community. Now, this was a really broken down rural community. 25% of the people were in poverty. Towns had lost a lot of population. Businesses were closing, and small farmers were, couldn't compete with big ag companies. So they looked around and they said, all right, but what are the assets that we have? And they found some. They had this rich agricultural experience. They have a willingness to try something new. They had land that was lying fallow in the winter, and they found that there were some colleges working on new energy technology. They discovered, actually, a professor had built a refinery that you could probably fit 6 of them in this room. It's about as big as a tractor trailer, and it could refine oil. And they thought, wow, this is amazing. This has been developed right here. So what can we do with this? They created something called the Arkansas Green Energy Network. And they got together, and what their goal is, they're starting right now 3 micro biorefineries. And so they decided they're going to grow camelina grass, which is an oil crop. It'll be grown in the winter, so it doesn't compete with food, and they can crush that and make biofuel out of it. They can also use waste oil, which can be used to make fuel too. So they gathered together this large network of people they got the farmers who were growing the camelina, they got the colleges developing this technology, and they created this network. And they said, okay, where's the demand? Because we talked about, part of the whole system is to look, where's the demand in the system? You don't just think, what do we have to grow, but who's gonna buy it? So they connected with Valero, and the school system said, we'll buy everything you can sell. They got a local community is going to start a waste oil collection system. So now, all the fryer grease from these restaurants that's now going down the sewer system and clogging the sewer system, they're now going to collect that and turn that into oil, and there's a little business that's doing that collecting. So what's holding a lot of this together is this network. And there's 25 players. They get together regularly, everything from legislators to college to farmers. The town of DeWitt is one of the entrepreneurs. They're doing one of these refineries, and corporate buyers. So you see here, it's a rural example of something very similar to what's happening in Cleveland, but I think you can start to see some of the same principles. We're in this together. We're something that we care about. We care about place. We care about ecology. We care about each other, and we're gonna work together to design a system. And so what's happening is there's a whole green energy sector taking shape in this what was formerly a broken down rural area. And they want to create. Their goal is to create several dozen businesses. And they hope that they have a model that can be replicated across the state and actually elsewhere. So they're creating wealth in ideas. There are low-income farmers who are learning new skills and growing camelina. Natural capital, they're preserving their sewer pipes, and they're creating financial capital and social capital of this alternative energy. So lots of kinds of capital are being created in this town, and they'll have lots of capability to be doing other things. Okay, so we start with values, we grow, we build on assets, and we want to create inclusive local enterprises. Now here's another interesting example of that we discovered. I just learned about this one recently, and after the shootings in Ferguson, it was interesting to discover that something like this had happened a decade ago in Cincinnati. And so there were race riots in Cincinnati back in 2001, and a local group got together and said, well, what's at the root of this? And they saw that lack of economic opportunity was one of the key reasons. And so they said, let's create a minority business accelerator. Let's help minority-owned businesses grow and become more successful. Now, there was a network at the heart of this. The Greater Cincinnati Foundation was involved. The city was involved. There were lots of players at the table. But they've had huge success. They got spending commitments from 40 corporations. They created nearly 2,000 jobs. The average revenue in these portfolio firms is now $29 million. So these are pretty substantial companies, and they created a loan fund. So I know one of the topics we have here is how do you create jobs, and lots of ways to do it. This is one very interesting example. Well, here's an example from Alberta, which is in Canada. And there, this just happened last year, that the community foundation there partnered with the city. And they each agreed to put in $2.5 million. Well, the city stepped up first, and the foundation agreed to match it. Because the guy who was doing it said, I don't think I can get my foundation board to agree to put in $2 million. But if the city does it, then we can match. So they're matching over several years. And they want to grow social enterprises. And social enterprises, as you probably know, are enterprises that have a social mission at their heart. So this is in particular aimed at social enterprise. You know, in Cincinnati, they aimed at minority business. Here, it's social enterprise. So you can have different targets. And green energy is another huge opportunity. I mean, if we talk about looking for demand in the system, green energy is huge demand. One of the places I visit and talk about in my book is Hull Wind. I live in the little town of Salem, Massachusetts, and I'm part of a little environmental organization there, and we wanted to close down a local coal plant and move to renewable energy. But we could not talk to the owners because the owners lived in Virginia. It was Dominion, and Dominion, the CEO, would not give us the time of the day. We were a tiny little speck of revenue in his massive corporation. Hull, on the other hand, has a municipally owned utility. So hats off to the mayor here for moving toward municipal control of electricity, because it makes a big difference. There, the people of Hull sat down with the people who ran the local utility and said, we want to put up a wind turbine. And they sat down over donuts and coffee, and they put up a wind turbine. It was the first commercial scale turbine on the East Coast. And it was done, a citizen group like this decided that they wanted to do it and met with because the utility was locally owned and municipally owned, they could sit down and talk with them and get something done. Community solar farms, I was talking to a gentleman earlier who's working on community solar farms. You know, if you can't put solar on your roof, I mean, if you can, great. If you can't, you can get together and create solar farms. We also have co-op power here with us today, and they're working on all kinds of community scale energy. So cooperative banks, we have at least one cooperative bank here with us today. It's another example of a community-owned enterprise. If you're a depositor, you own that bank, and that bank is rooted in its community and committed to making a difference there. Cooperative groceries, I passed one on the road on the way in. So all of these are community-owned enterprises, and they're very different than, say, Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. I mean, they're locally rooted. They care about the community. We want to link to demand. This is a really key point. You know, I talked about Evergreen and the large institutional buyers there. One of the most amazing examples is University Hospitals in Cleveland. They were building several $1 billion of facilities, and they decided we want to do 80% of this, at least 80% of this for local businesses, minority businesses, and women-owned businesses. And they actually exceeded their goals. They wanted to procure 80% from local and regional firms, and the actual result was 91%. So an amazing success story. Now we're talking $1.2 billion worth of building, and they're keeping 91% of it locally. That has a multiplier effect. And there are more and more hospitals interested in this. We're working with both hospitals and universities that want to increase what we call their anchor mission. They want to help their local communities and be more deliberate about that. The Affordable Care Act has some provisions that really encourage hospitals to do this. And there are communities of practice being set up. A really interesting one we've just started working with is in Toronto. The mayor, there's a community foundation there working with the city, and together they're creating what they call a community of practice for public sector social procurement. And as far as I know, they invented that phrase, social procurement. But what are you buying locally? What are you buying from what kind of businesses? And they're going to get anchor institutions together over a year and talk about how can we learn how to do this better. So assets become opportunities when they connect to demand. So as communities, we're thinking like a business now. We have some assets. Where are the buyers? Where's the large-scale demand? That's when you begin to see a real opportunity. And then we need to strengthen our support networks, because we can't do this alone. I mean, Real Pickles, they're working with a network of impact investors. Evergreen Cooperatives has all kinds of networks around it. Arkansas Green Energy Network, is a network. The Minority Business Accelerator was launched by a variety of institutions. I know there's interest here in local food. A great example, not too far away, is the Vermont Farm to Plate initiative. And there they have state legislation that helped create a framework. They want to grow the food and agricultural economy. There's 100 organizations involved in working groups in what's called the Farm to Plate Network. The Community Foundation is involved, the legislator's been involved, and they're trying to get farm to school networks. They want to get farm to school programs going at every school in Vermont. This is a picture here of Vermont Smoking Cure. It's a locally owned meat company, and they received an investment from the Vermont Community Foundation, which has a policy of they want to invest 5% of all their assets locally. So there's a great example. So why do we need networks? This is the Learning Action Lab. I just came back from that meeting. These are the Native American groups that we're working with. I mean, isolated companies, everybody talks about 90% failure rate of businesses. I don't think that the rate is so high when you have networked companies. I haven't seen a study, but I have seen that among cooperatives, the rate of failure is lower. My hunch is that networked companies supported by networks of support have a higher rate of success, and together we can do what doesn't really seem possible. We need to anchor ownership locally and broadly. We started out talking about this. I want to come back to it because it's so important. And some of you may have heard of Mondragon, large cooperative in Spain, and this is kind of the gold standard of local ownership, broad ownership, and networked. The company is itself a network. It's about $16 billion in revenue. It has over 200 businesses in it and 74,000 employees. And when one of these businesses is in trouble, there was one of them that went down recently. There was a large bankruptcy among one of their businesses. But what they do is they try to shift employment among the other businesses in their network rather than laying people off. And the result has been lower unemployment in this region of Spain, and this has been documented. They have a 15% unemployment in their region compared to 25% around the country. So this one company has a notable effect in the local economy. This is one of my pet points here, as I think that we today are at a turning point where we could have a major movement to employee ownership. There is a retiring wave of baby boom owners. Only 1 in 7 of them say that they plan to pass their company on to their family. And so where are these companies going to go? Are they going to go out of business? Are they going to go public? Are they going to be sold to someone out of the community? This has been called a $5 trillion opportunity over the next 20 years. It's going to be this major transfer of ownership of some kind. I think with the right support networks, it could become a major opportunity for employee ownership. And that's something I think that communities can work on. You could begin to pilot that in your own community. Where are the businesses that people are going to be retiring or selling, and can we keep those locally owned? Yeah, and there's lots of benefits of employee ownership for the companies, for the employees, for the community, including you can really reduce your taxes, and for the selling owner. The upshot of all of this work of community wealth building is that you keep wealth local. We have greater circulation of dollars, and it's been shown that small businesses, they have more per capita job growth, and locally owned businesses, there's higher income growth associated with that. So lots of benefits. And again, coming back to this question of structure, we are designing the kind of economy that we want. And structure is purpose expressed through design. So what is our purpose? And how do we design for that? In creating structures that can hold that purpose in perpetuity. I think that if we're going to name the kind of economy right now, we have what I call an extractive economy. It's designed for the maximum extraction of financial wealth. And what we are designing, what we're aiming for is a generative economy. It's an economy that is designed to create the conditions for life to thrive. I mean, this is the original purpose of economies, and it's one that we can return to. Now, as we jump into this work, and Greening Greenfield is far along in this work, you may often have the feeling that you don't know what you're doing. That's normal. As one person said, welcome to the world of not knowing what you're doing. Nobody knew how to do this work. When we started this, nobody knew how to do this work. These are a few of the principles that we figured out. I'm sure it's not everything. But together, we can do what seems impossible. So thank you.